Hi, welcome back to History Made Simply. My name's Nick Shaw. I'm the Senior Historian at History Made Simply, and today we're going to be discussing an aspect of World War II that's important to Britain and its Commonwealth and Empire, but less important to the main protagonists of World War II, which were Germany and Russia and the United States, and of course Japan. Now, war took place in North Africa from June 1940 until May 1943, and devolves into a number of different phases. Why did the war start in North Africa? Well, largely the war started in North Africa because Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, made a horrendous error. At least one can say that with the benefit of hindsight. The horrendous error was to actually enter World War II. Italy was an economically weak power. It had very few natural, and indeed today remains weak in natural resources, but it had a substantial army. Ill-equipped, yes, but big. Now, the Italians controlled Libya, which was the colony west of Egypt. And Egypt was, of course, controlled by Britain and its empire and Commonwealth. Why was Egypt vitally important to Britain? Because of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal means that Britain could move resources and troops from England to the jewel in its imperial crown, India, in less than 3 months. Unfortunately, if you couldn't get your ships through the Mediterranean and then down through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, you had to go the long route, which was via the Cape of Good Hope, which essentially added thousands of miles to the movement of supplies, weapons and men. And this essentially, of course, is what happened for the bulk of the period we're discussing. Britain did maintain limited control of the central Mediterranean via the retention of its naval base on the island of Malta, which is south of Sicily, and it is astride the supply route from Italy, Sicily to North Africa. It's important to realise that the Germans and the Italians, who had various plans for taking Malta, never bothered to put them into action. Why? Well, because they weren't very good at maritime warfare. Britain, for centuries, had control of the seas. For example, at the beginning of World War I, 4 out of every 10 ships that went through the Suez Canal were British. So Britain had an enormous merchant navy and a very big navy. At this stage, certainly the second biggest, possibly the biggest navy in the world, the biggest being the United States, until, of course, Pearl Harbor. The point of the North African campaign was to regain control of the Mediterranean. Because obviously, whilst the Italians controlled Libya, Sicily, and the Vichy French had control of Tunisia, it was very difficult for Britain to move convoys safely through the Mediterranean. Therefore, strategically, we'd already suffered a major blow because we were going to have to move everything that was going to the Middle East or India now had to go via the Cape of Good Hope, which added thousands and thousands of miles to each trip carried out by each convoy of either troops, weapons, or supplies. Why is this important? Well, India was critically important to Britain throughout World War II as a source of armed forces. And indeed, almost from the outset of June 1940, there was an Indian infantry division attached to the British Commonwealth and Empire forces in the Middle East. An infantry division has about 17,000 men. So, that really covers the strategic issues. In other words, we couldn't, even if we had a large enough army, trained and well equipped to go over to the offensive, we were unable to go over to the offensive because we had to send things round the Cape of Good Hope, not through the Mediterranean. Anyway, as I say, that now covered that. So we were effectively, until we could regain control of the Mediterranean Sea, Britain, its Commonwealth and Empire, which, remember, by June 1940 was standing alone against the Axis powers, we had no option. We had to hold on to Egypt, come what may. But we were on the defensive. Something that Winston Churchill regularly forgot about. Now, the very first campaign, and this was long before the Germans actually came into North Africa, was just against the Italians. The Italians had very large, ill-equipped forces, ill-trained forces in Libya. In June 1940, when Mussolini declared war on Great Britain and France, the Italians made a small advance over the Libyan border into Egypt. They moved about 80 miles. We're talking. That's a long, long way from Cairo. Now, if one just looked at the numbers, the Italians outnumbered British forces enormously. In fact, they had over 200,000 troops in Libya, and we had about 40,000 effectives in Egypt. On that basis, you'd have thought it was virtually impossible for us to push them even back 80 miles, back to the borders of Libya and Egypt. But we were fortunate in the very first of many commanders of the Western Desert, Egypt, and the Middle Eastern armies. The man in charge was a general called Archibald Wavell, who, unusually for a British general, was quite an academic. He published books of poetry, for example. He went on, after commanding British forces in the Middle East, to be the military commander of British and Indian forces in India. And he eventually became Viceroy of India. Now, so Wavell was quite an unusual general. Most generals, let's use Erwin Rommel as an example. Erwin Rommel did not write poetry. His hobbies were photography and war. So, and that applied to most German generals. They had some sort of practical hobby, and they had the study of war. So let's go back to Archibald Wavell. As I say, Wavell was very unusual for a British general. British generals did things like go hunting. Very few of them actually studied war. Obviously, you didn't get to be a general without going to staff college, which is the equivalent of a military university. So they knew how to control quite large numbers of men. What they didn't really understand was modern warfare as practiced by the Germans. Fortunately for them, at the outset of the war in North Africa, there were no Germans. The Germans didn't even begin to arrive until February, March 1941, and we're in June 1940 at the moment. So, yes, on the face of it, if you just looked at the numbers, the Italians had overwhelming force. However, the British army in Egypt was made up of professionals, long service professionals, most of whom had been in the army for 8 to 10 years, often more. They knew how to fight. It's the case that very few members of the British army present in Egypt in June 1940 will have not been shot at. That's because India there were constant minor rebellions, riots, and all sorts of problems in India, and indeed other parts of the British Empire between World War I and World War II. Now, it's important to understand other operational and tactical things. The Italians had quite a good navy, but it was a navy without fighting experience and without a great deal of what's called sea time, i.e. most of the Italian navy spent most of its life tied up in port. The British Navy exercised constantly and was without question the most professional part of our armed forces throughout World War II, and they understood absolutely how important Malta was. Without Malta, supplies could have flowed in to North Africa to the Italians, and later the Italians and Germans. Well, the only thing stopping supplies getting through, if we'd lost Malta, would have been British submarines, which would simply have not been adequate to stop the flow of supplies. So, what did that mean? What does it mean because we control Malta? We were slowing the flow of supplies into North Africa. If you don't have enough petrol, you can't keep your troops already probably 1,500 miles from Tripoli, the main port in Libya. You can't keep them well supplied. Without supplies, because most of North Africa is desert, even though the Italians had been doing all they could in Libya to alter that case, supplies of water were very, very limited. And I will now bring in an anecdote from my father, who served in the Western Desert from the spring of 1941 to the completion of the campaign in Tunisia in May 1943. Water was in such short supply. My father was in a Hussars regiment, which meant he was a tank commander. Anyway, what he and his crew would do is they would get a supply of water on a daily basis, never enough water to drink and to wash in and to cook in, and most importantly to top up the radiator of the tank with. Now they obviated the principal use of water, i.e. topping up the radiator in the tank, by peeing into the radiator. I'm not sure whether this was a common practice. It was certainly the practice in the tank that my father commanded. So, from the outset, it's very important to realise that all operations in North Africa were governed by supplies and supply routes. Now, the Italians were already a long way. They were 1,500 miles at least from their main port, Tripoli. They had minor ports, they had Benghazi, and they had a place that would become world famous, Tobruk. But it wasn't easy. But then there weren't railways. They had to send supplies, including water, including petrol and diesel, forward in trucks. And they didn't have enough trucks. The number of trucks you could keep going up and down the supply line determined how many troops you could actually keep active at the front. You know, there's nowhere that you're 80 miles inside the Egyptian border. There's very, very few water sources, very few, and they're just wells. They're nothing special. There's no lakes. There's no rivers. It's a desolate place. There's no or very little local food. Again, Mussolini had ensured that Libya was being converted into an agricultural zone for the Italian Empire. It's also important to realise that the Italian Empire did not just consist of Libya in Africa. It also consisted of Eritrea and Abyssinia, which had been conquered in... Eritrea had been an Italian colony, and Abyssinia they conquered in 1936. Abyssinia being the only country of any substance in Africa controlled by Africans. All other parts of Africa in 1939-1940 were colonies. Now, Britain had colonies in Egypt, technically not a colony, but in effect it was a colony. Sudan, which was a colony, most of East Africa, south of Abyssinia, and there was probably what could be described as the jewel in the crown then. There was the Dominion of South Africa. Now, the South Africans supplied substantial numbers of troops to fight in North Africa. They're an important aspect of the fighting in North Africa, as are two of the other dominions within the British Empire. Dominions were effectively independent states within the British Empire and Commonwealth. And in fact, they were members of the Commonwealth, not of the Empire. The other very, very important dominions to the North African campaign were Australians and New Zealanders. The New Zealanders provided probably the best infantry division that anybody had in the Mediterranean and North African operational area. The Australians had extremely tough infantry. The South Africans supplied, amongst other things, large numbers of armoured cars. Armoured cars were critically important in the North African campaign because they could cover big distances and they could scout incredibly effectively. They could tell you what the enemy was up to anywhere within 200 miles of where they started. Now, there were also other developments in North Africa. It was clear that there was going to be a geographical problem in North Africa. Not only the question of supplies getting to the front, but also the fact that most parts of North Africa, if you stopped and built a defensive line, there would always be an open flank to the south, because your defensive line couldn't go on and on and on and on deep into the Sahara Desert. This was something that when Rommel arrived, he immediately understood and made ferocious use of throughout his advances. So, how were 40,000 admittedly reasonably well trained British troops able to overcome 200,000 plus Italians? Well, rather simply because from June 1940 to Christmas 1940, the British launched two very significant counterattacks, and they pushed the Italians all the way back to a place called Gazala. Now, Gazala's 800 miles from the Egyptian border, and what happened was essentially the British, Commonwealth and Empire troops cut across the desert and cut the Italian supply line. The Italians were forced to retreat. They were pursued by mainly Australian infantry, and unbelievably, Wavell captured 130,000 Italian prisoners from June 1940 to the end of 1940. 135,000, that's a hell of a lot. So in other words, he essentially destroyed the available Italian army in Libya. Looking at the bigger picture, globally, of course at this time, the Germans had overrun France, were beginning to fight the battle in the Atlantic, and were bombing southern Britain, mainly, not exclusively, but mainly. They'd lost the Battle of Britain, which meant that they were unable to effect an invasion of Britain, but they had yet to go to make the ultimate strategic mistake and invade Russia. So, reverting back to North Africa, it's important to remember that Western North Africa was controlled by the power in France that took over after the French Republic had been defeated. It was called Vichy France because it had relocated its government to Vichy, which is a town in southwest France. So they controlled Algeria, Tunisia. Now, this was a long way from where we were fighting our battles in North Africa, so at the moment it didn't matter. Anyway, the single most important thing to remember is we controlled Malta, and we needed to regain control of the Mediterranean before we did anything else. This is because, as I pointed out, it meant that all supplies going to the Middle East had to go round the Cape of Good Hope, which was thousands of miles further than they would otherwise have had to travel. And that meant that a much larger number of merchant ships had to be committed to supplying the Middle East. Also, it was now, because effectively the Axis controlled the Mediterranean, it meant that everywhere else in the British Empire east of Suez had to be supplied round the Cape of Good Hope, which meant that that even if we wanted to invade somewhere else, Spain, Portugal, anywhere, we just didn't have the resources. We didn't have the shipping. We didn't have the manpower trained manpower in the army as yet. Eventually, the British Army would reach 2.9 million men. But that was in the summer of 1945, when the war in Europe was over. There simply weren't enough trained troops in 1940. There weren't enough spare merchant ships. There weren't the specialist ships that we would discover through trial and error that were going to be required to make invasions anywhere. We were on the back foot, we being Britain, its Commonwealth and Empire, and we were alone. Now, that's not as bad as it sounds, because the British Commonwealth and its empire had a population of 500 million people, so it wasn't a complete disaster, but we had a large army, Indian army in India, but of course Churchill was loath to employ much of that outside of India and the Far East, because he knew that giving the Indians a really active part in the war would ensure that they would demand independence. I mean, actually, the reality is they demanded independence anyway. And Britain was too exhausted to do anything about it. This is a discussion for another day, however. So, from June 1940 to the end of December 1940, Wavell effectively destroyed the Italian army in Libya. He had other concerns as well. He was also in overall control of the campaign in East Africa to retake Abyssinia, and he had on the northern border of Palestine then a British mandate, and Transjordan, not a British mandate but sort of quasi part of the British Empire. He had Vichy France again, because the French obviously kept their colonies in Lebanon and Syria. He would deal with those. Those would be dealt with in 1941. Now, why were they important? Well, had the Germans elected not to invade Russia and instead to really put serious force into the Mediterranean, the Luftwaffe, based in Syria, could have got hold of what General Alenbrook, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, i.e. the most senior member of the British Army, described as our Achilles heel, which is Basra. Now, Basra is somewhere that, courtesy of the various wars in Iraq, many people will be familiar with. Basra was the main place where Britain refined oil bought from Persia, bought from Iraq, and transported it to all other parts of the British Empire. That's why General Alenbrook described Basra as Britain's Achilles heel. And Wavell was responsible for protecting that part of the British Empire as well. So, after the British had effectively wiped the floor with the Italians, it was quite obvious to Hitler that he was going to have to send at least some troops to North Africa to pull the Italian chestnuts out of the fire. Incidentally, the Italians weren't only screwing things up in North Africa, they were also making errors in East Africa, in Abyssinia, and they were making fools of themselves in the Balkans. They had taken Albania and were attacking Greece. This is important because, ever impulsive, Churchill decided to involve the British Empire and Commonwealth in protecting Greece. This is what would reasonably be called strategic overstretch. Now, I brought Greece into the talk because Churchill, ever the optimist, decided to strip Wavell of his best troops and send them to help the Greeks before finishing off the campaign in North Africa. So where this left the British in January 1941 was defending a line at a place called Gazala, which is on the Libyan coast, but most of Wavell's best troops had now been sent to fight in Greece. This would be a disaster because they would eventually be retreating from the mainland of Greece to Crete, and then the Germans made an expensive but brilliant invasion of Crete and forced the British to evacuate for all their forces from Greek islands and mainland Greece. Meanwhile, the Germans also sent a very successful, or he'd been successful and had come to Hitler's notice for a variety of reasons. They sent a very successful panzer commander, panzers being German armoured forces, to North Africa. He arrived in February 1941. His name was Erwin Rommel. Rommel had a very successful war to date, particularly in the invasion of France, where his forces had broken through the French lines, and his division's about 15 to 17,000 men, and in the case of a panzer division, it has about 120 tanks, 150 tanks. It has armoured cars, self-propelled artillery, towed anti-aircraft guns, most notably the 88mm anti-tank, which was originally an anti-aircraft gun, but had been discovered to be very good as an anti-tank weapon in the Polish campaign in 1939. He had ended up, I think it was certainly Normandy, but perhaps Brittany. So he'd done incredibly well, and he'd previously been in charge of Hitler's bodyguard. So Hitler knew him and was aware of him and could see that he was a very good general. Also that he was a very good commander of panzer troops. Panzer troops consisted of mechanised forces, that's tanks, armoured cars, half-tracks, which were half-wheel vehicles, but the back half of them was effectively like a tank. And as I said, he'd done very, very well indeed in France, so that's why he got command. Before, again, we're still not even up to the invasion of Russia yet, so he got command and he was sent to North Africa, where originally he was given one panzer division and one what was called light division, also motorised. There were three types of mobile divisions in the German army. Panzer divisions, which were tank-heavy formations, but they still had 6,000 infantry, but the infantry were all mounted either in trucks or they were mounted in half-tracks. So he had one panzer division and one light division. The light division, again, was motorised, certainly. So the Germans didn't have very many horses in North Africa at all. Not the case in their invasion of Russia. Their invasion of Russia, most infantry divisions in the German army remained very, very horse dependent. And indeed, in a classic operational British mistake, when the British army mechanised and motorised in 1935, they were left with 500,000 horses that they no longer needed. What did they do? They sold them to the Germans. This enabled the Germans to equip probably another 20 infantry divisions with horses. Anyway, back to North Africa. So, spring of 1941, we have a situation where the Germans are just arriving in North Africa, and courtesy of Churchill's desire to occupy the Germans in Europe, he has sent the best of Wavell's forces to Greece, and the Germans are arriving. So the Germans arrive, and because we're dealing with a general who's very good at mobile warfare, as soon as he's got a couple of decent formations, a couple of brigades, Rommel attacks. Right, his supply line's still relatively short. Tunis to the Gazala line, which is where we were deployed, was not very far, maybe 400 miles. So he had plenty of trucks to deliver his supplies at that stage. So once again, we're in a situation where the British Army has, courtesy of the higher command of the British Army, i.e. Winston Churchill, who, remember, was not only the Prime Minister, he was also the Secretary of State for Defence. So he interfered at lower levels, hence the reason for sending large numbers of troops to lose all their equipment once again in Greece. So the British were caught off balance. They had inadequately trained troops now defending their positions effectively at the bottom of the Gulf of Sirte, which is the sort of, if you like, the bit that the Mediterranean bites out of Libya. So they were and Rommel's forces were building up in strength. Rommel's German forces were building up in strength. So he pushed the British through the spring and summer back all the way from the Gulf of Sirte to the Egyptian border. What he was unable to do, he took Benghazi, but he was unable to take Tobruk, which was defended largely by Australians. And one can only say that the only thing worse than being up against Australian infantry is being up against New Zealand infantry. They were by far the toughest fighting troops in North Africa throughout the North African campaign. So, the British were pushed all the way back once again to the Egyptian border. Now, what did this mean? This meant, of course, that Rommel, yes, he could get some supplies into Benghazi, but Benghazi is still a long way from the Egyptian border. So Rommel was at the end of a very long supply line. The British were holding on in Tobruk, so he couldn't really press on further He was only 120 miles, 150 miles from Alexandria, 200 miles from Cairo, but he simply couldn't press on with Tobruk in his rear. The British Navy could always get supplies through to Tobruk, and Tobruk was defended, as I pointed out, by some extremely resolute Australians. There were British troops there as well, and South African troops. But all in all, the British Army was, in the spring of 1941, was weakened. It was weakened largely because we'd sent the best troops to fight in Greece and Crete, and because the British Army simply wasn't up at this stage to facing German mechanised and motorised formations. Now, Britain's reaction to this problem, the professional reaction of the British Army, was to try and copy the German way of making war. Needless to say, they made a hash of it. And this is the principal reason that the war went on and on and on. Anyway, the first British objective had to be to relieve the besieged port of Tobruk. And Wavell was not in command anymore. He'd been sent off to India. We now come to a whole series of British commanders of forces in Egypt and the Middle East, who frankly just weren't up to the job. One of the principal reasons that the campaign in North Africa went on for so long. Very few British generals were capable of fighting a mobile mechanised war. They had troops who were equipped to fight a mobile mechanised war, but the troops weren't well trained to fight a mobile mechanised war either. So things would just roll backwards and forwards. There were a couple of counterattacks, and eventually we did relieve Tobruk. And by the winter of 1941, Rommel was back where he started. The British were pouring troops into the Middle East. Not only troops, but also more naval forces, and most importantly, the RAF. By reconquering or relieving Tobruk and then retaking Benghazi, we had created a situation where, again, the RAF and the Navy were to some extent in control of the central and eastern Mediterranean. And fortunately for us, in June 1941, Hitler committed the most important error of his career, or the most important error. He invaded Russia. Thereafter, North Africa for the Germans became an absolute sideshow. Rommel rarely got all the things, or indeed any of the things that he asked for in the way of tanks, in the way of men, German men, that is, not Italian men. There were plenty of Italians available. So we now move on to what happened again. The British built up a defensive position called the Gazala Line. The Gazala Line was manned, amongst many other things, by a sergeant in a Hussars regiment called Dennis Shaw, my father. And so some of the anecdotes that I'm now going to give you come from that time. Again, it's important to recognise that the British Army, the Commonwealth Army and the Imperial forces were quite good at fighting static warfare, but they really weren't very good at mobile warfare as yet. Also, the Germans had much better equipment, and, for example, it would have been not unreasonable to say that the Germans controlled the night. The Germans would send out their repair equipment. They had specialised repair equipment. We did not have specialised repair equipment to recover any damaged trucks, tanks, half-tracks. They'd bring them back and start repairing them overnight. The British abandoned a tank that had lost its tracks would, generally speaking, be abandoned. So we needed a lot more stuff than the Germans had just to stay in the field. Anyway, so we were back where we started, except, of course, that Rommel now had 2 panzer divisions and what amounted to a paratroop division. Plus he had hundreds of thousands of Italians. So the British, by this time, having poured troops in serious numbers into Egypt, outnumbered the Germans, but could not outfight them. There were only about 40 or 50,000 Germans in the field, and there were at least 250,000 British Empire Commonwealth troops in Egypt, including, as I've mentioned, my father. British tanks were inferior to German tanks, and the British really did not understand how to fight mobile warfare. I appreciate that's probably the 3rd or the 4th time I've said it. But even if they had, their equipment was inadequate to do so. So, really, 1941 was again a year where Rommel had the initiative, and he took the initiative. Anyway, probably the most important date for Britain and its Commonwealth and Empire is December the 7th, 1941, because then the Americans came in to the war, courtesy of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the Japanese also attacked Hong Kong, Malaya, and all other British colonies in the Far East, which was just another strategic and logistic headache for Britain. Anyway, so the Gazala line, which was the defensive line the British had created, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what that involved in a minute. The Gazala line had an open flank, as did any defensive line, until you got back to about 100 miles west of Alexandria. And we will be getting to El Alamein very shortly. Anyway, so the British had an open flank. Now, by now, not only were there British, Commonwealth and Imperial forces defending the British defensive line, the Gazala line, there were Greeks, there were Free French, and indeed it was the Free French who were holding the end of the Gazala line, the open flank. And they were, of course, the first to get pummeled when Rommel started his spring offensive in 1941. Now, the Gazala line it wasn't a continuous it was 70 or 80 miles long. It didn't consist of a continuous line of trenches or anything like that. There were vast minefields, but there were what were called boxes. Boxes were defended positions where there were some armour, some infantry, some artillery. And there were boxes. In between the boxes, the remainder of the British mobile forces operated. But of course the boxes had both fit field artillery, the British had pretty good field artillery, and medium artillery. Again, the British had quite good medium artillery. So it wasn't so easy for the Germans to penetrate between the boxes. However, they did. Or rather, what they did was they went round the end of the bottom box, which was the Free French forces. So what were the British to do? Were they to sit in their boxes, wait till they'd run out of water and other supplies and petrol? Because that, of course, was what was going to happen, because the Germans were charging south to north behind the Gazala line, cutting off the British supply lines. Or were they to run for it? Well, eventually they started to run for it. And this is known within the British Army as the Gazala Gallop. Now we can move on to an anecdote about my father. The Gazala Gallop, basically, once the British had decided to leave their boxes and run for it, the Gazala Gallop meant that the British Army was just disorganised, completely and utterly disorganised. And all the Germans had to do was keep up the advance and the pressure. They were still fairly close to their supply dumps, so they could do that. Anyway, my father spoke fluent German. Not many people of any rank in the British Army spoke fluent German. He was frequently, therefore, sent back to what was called the B echelon. So he wouldn't be with the fighting part of his Hussars regiment, he'd be back with the supply column, because that was where German prisoners of war were sent for interrogation, and that's one of the things my father did. He interrogated Germans. Anyway, suffice it to say that fairly quickly after he'd started his spring offensive, Rommel reached Tobruk. Only this time my father didn't like the look of things. He thought Tobruk would fall fairly quickly. So he went to his commanding officer and said, "Sir, I know that you're a homosexual." And remember, homosexuality was illegal in British law in 1942. "I know you're a homosexual. If you don't put me in charge of the next ambulance column out, I'm going to go to our regimental commander and tell him you're a homosexual, and you'll be in deep doo-doo when that happens, as we both know." So my father was put in charge of a ambulance convoy. And now I'm afraid it wasn't like Ice Cold in Alex, the movie that many people listening to this cast will have heard of. There was no beautiful blonde nurse. What there was moving the column east as fast as possible. And obviously, as they got red crosses on, there were very few attacks from the Luftwaffe, and people gave way. So my father escaped to fight another day. Many people did not escape to fight another day. Anyway, moving on. The Germans were once again at the Egyptian border. But now they pushed on beyond the Egyptian border. At long last, there was a geographical feature that enabled the British to close the open desert flank. It's called the Qattara Depression. The Qattara Depression starts about 150 miles west of Alexandria, and by this stage the British were reforming at El Alamein, which is just a railway stop on the way to Tobruk and Benghazi. So the British were falling back. Various commanders had been sacked and replaced by various other commanders who were also just not up to the job. Anyway, fortunately for the British Army, Churchill and General Alanbrooke, the CIGS, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, were passing through Egypt on their way to a meeting with Stalin to discuss the war and plans. So Churchill decided that he could not go on with the then commander, whose name was Auchinleck. So he sent Auchinleck off to India, where he would serve under by then Field Marshal Wavell for the rest of the war. And Auchinleck took a few other useless generals with him. There then arose a problem as to who was to take command of the Middle East and what was now called the Eighth Army, i.e. the force that actually was holding Rommel back to the best of its ability. So we're now in roughly the end of May 1942. My father has got back to with his column of ambulances. So he was back behind British lines, and the British Army now needed a period of rest and recuperation, frankly, because they'd lost lots of equipment in the run back, they'd lost lots of men, and they'd been defeated in a nutshell. Anyway, Churchill could see, and Alanbrooke could see, that a change of command was necessary. And what was required was a good fighting general to actually command the Eighth Army, and a imperturbable general to be the Middle Eastern commander. Remember, we'd now reached the stage where the Germans had invaded Russia. You know, we're talking about June 1941. I mean, obviously, the Germans invading Russia was very handy as far as the British were concerned. It meant that they wouldn't be sending many more good troops to fight in North Africa, notwithstanding the fact that they couldn't supply many more troops than they already had in North Africa. Anyway, the Germans advanced, and this was before Auchinleck, before Churchill arrived and sacked Auchinleck, and Auchinleck and his commanders managed to stop them at El Alamein. Now, so we have a first Battle of El Alamein, which took place towards the end of what took place during July 1942, and we stopped them. But there was a reason for that. Because of the geographical feature of the Qattara Depression, the front was fairly fixed. There was no open flank for Rommel to go round. He had to stand and fight his way through a defensive line. So at long last, the British were fighting a battle that they could actually possibly win. They weren't mobile, they were static, and basically there was no open flank, so Rommel would have to just bash through somewhere. Well, he tried, and he failed, largely because we held the high ground. There were a variety of ridges that we held, and armoured divisions are not great things for taking cliffs, mountains and ridges. He just didn't have enough infantry, and also he was well within range constantly of British field and medium artillery, plus also the RAF. The Luftwaffe was now a long way from its supplies. Like the Afrika Korps and the Italians, it was at the end of an incredibly long supply line. So there was a limited amount that the Luftwaffe could do, whereas the British were now 60 miles from one of their main supply depots, Alexandria. Also, the Royal Navy's main base in the Mediterranean was Alexandria. So they could send battleships forward to bombard the Germans. Anyway, so Rommel had reached more or less the limit of where he was going, of where he could go, on the basis of his logistics situation. So he sat down and began to build a defensive line. The defensive line, by October 1942, would have several million mines in it. Most of these mines were anti-tank mines, which, if you were an infantryman, you could safely walk over an anti-tank mine because you weren't going to be heavy enough to get the mine going. But there were plenty of anti-personnel mines as well. The British also were entrenching, as it were, and creating vast minefields. So really, when Churchill and Alan got to Egypt, they decided Auchinleck had to go, and that they had to bring in a new overall commander for the Middle East, and they decided on a general called Harold Alexander, who had conducted a very good retreat from Malaya into Burma, an extremely difficult task, which he had dealt with in his normal, imperturbable fashion. But he was not a great field commander. He was a good overall commander. And remember, he was still controlling armies in the Persian Gulf, Palestine. We'd taken Syria by that stage as well. And he had plenty to do without actually trying to control the 8th Army himself. So Churchill looked around and decided on a general called Gott, who was commanding one of the British mechanised divisions, to be the commander. All was well until Gott. All these changeovers took place between Churchill and Alan Brooke's first visit to Egypt on their way to discuss matters with Stalin, and on their return visit. Unfortunately, as Gott was flying up to meet with Churchill and Alan Brooke, his plane crashed and he was killed. So Alan Brooke was then able to step in and suggest that one of his protégés, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, should command the 8th Army. He said that Alexander and Montgomery would make a very good combination. For once, Churchill listened to his senior military advisor, and that is what happened. Now, Montgomery was unlike the majority of British generals. He didn't have hobbies. Alexander, for example, was quite a good watercolour painter. His hobby was war. He was a consummate professional who believed in making sure that before going into battle, his troops were well trained and well commanded, well supplied, and ready to go. And he wouldn't budge from that. So when Churchill and Auchinleck got back, Montgomery had arrived and he'd already started preparing his army. For example, he started a mine lifting school. Unbelievably, quite a lot of the combat troops in the 8th Army had no experience of lifting mines. They just had to go around them. So he insisted that all British troops that would be in the front line, all British, Commonwealth and Empire troops that would be in the front line, would know how to lift mines. A good example of training his troops and minimising casualties. Churchill impatiently asked when he'd make his attack, and he said, probably not until the end of October, beginning of November, sir. And he said, but we can't wait that long. And he said, unless you want a massacre, you'll have to wait that long. These troops are not trained to fight modern warfare in a desert situation. They need to be trained properly first. And because the professional head of the British Army was at Churchill's shoulder, that is what happened. Thank goodness. So really, so at the end of August 1942, the Axis launched its final offensive in order to break through to Alexandria and to the road to Cairo. It failed. It failed because, and this is where we introduce another extremely important aspect, because A, we knew where the attack was coming from and what its objective was, and Montgomery was now in charge tactically of the 8th Army. So, how did we know? Well, we knew because of what was going on at Bletchley Park in Middle England. The Poles, had been in possession of a machine codenamed Enigma. Enigma was the main method for the Axis powers to communicate with their armies in the field, their armies at home. The Enigma machine was considered to be an unbreakable code. Fortunately for us, we had a few brilliant men, including a man called Alan Turing, who arguably shortened World War II by a year through his efforts. And we devised a method of breaking the code. And it's important to realise that the settings on the Enigma machine were changed every day. Originally, the Enigma machine had 3 wheels that could be set. And the problem was that those wheels were altered the position of those wheels was altered every 24 hours. Now 3 times, 26 times 26 times 26 times 3 is a lot of combinations. Anyway, we had managed to break into particularly the German army cipher of Enigma. unfortunately, we did not manage to break into the U-boat cipher. And anyway, Dönitz, who commanded the U-boats and was indeed the final commander-in-chief of all German forces in 1945, was a suspicious individual. And he insisted that the number of wheels should be increased from 3 to 5. So that was 26 times 26 times 26 times 26 times 26 times 5. I mean, unbelievable number of variations. So, fortunately, the German army went on using 3 wheels for longer than the other armed forces did. So, whilst we didn't know for great periods what the Kriegsmarine was up to, or the Luftwaffe, we did know what the German army was up to. And every day, Rommel had to send back a list of his order of battle. What does that mean? It means he had to list the number of effective troops he had, the number of effective pieces of artillery he had, the number of working tanks he had, the number of working trucks, and so on. And within 48 hours, Montgomery and Alexander would get the details. The same details that he was sending back to Kesselring, who was by then the commander of Axis forces in the Mediterranean. The British would know, or rather, the commanding general of the 8th Army and the C&C of the Middle East would know what the Germans had available to fight with 2 days before. Well, this is unbelievably useful. And so it enabled Montgomery and Alexander to be rather confident that given the rebuilding and retraining of the 8th Army and other armed forces, Commonwealth and Imperial armed forces in Egypt and the Middle East, that they would be able to hold their own at long last with the Germans. So, really, Churchill had been told nothing could happen until towards the end of October, and he was forced to put up with it. You know, he couldn't. The last Axis, as I pointed out, the last Axis offensive was at the end of August, and Montgomery had stopped it. So he'd already achieved one victory. Now, there are disputes, and these disputes would end up in libel actions after World War II as to who stopped the Germans. The first Battle of El Alamein took place towards the middle and end of July 1942, and Auchinleck was technically still in control. But he was no longer in control at the end of August. Montgomery and Alexander were in control. And Auchinleck was sent off to be effectively the commander of the Indian Army. So, really, the tempo of the war was now changing, and it was changing in favour of the British in North Africa anyway. The Germans were now intensely involved in the war in Russia, which absorbed 4/5 of the Axis ground forces. And really, North Africa was reduced from their point of view to being, to an extent, a sideshow. We move on now to October 1942, when Montgomery had, for example, sent every single combat unit in the 8th Army through a training program. And in particular, they'd all visited this mine lifting school. And he had come up with a battle plan that the British Army was capable of executing. Firstly, he now had a massive amount of artillery. He had about 1,000 field guns and medium guns. Now the Germans had considerably less. He had probably a 3 to 4 to 1 advantage if you discount mainly the Italians, not entirely the Italians. The Italians had a few good divisions, but if you discount them, largely the British had by October been re-equipped. Fortunately, when Rommel took Tobruk in June 1940, Churchill received the news in the White House, where he was in conference with the President of the United States and the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Roosevelt obviously felt somewhat sorry for Churchill, as yet again the British had suffered another defeat. So he immediately offered to send 400 of the new American tank, the Sherman tank, to the Western Desert. Now, these arrived in time for my father, for example, to be re-equipped with a Sherman tank and to fight the Second Battle of El Alamein. Now, the Second Battle of El Alamein was not about movement. It was actually about holding the Germans and the Italians in their defence lines and pounding them. Only when, via Enigma, did Montgomery get the news that Rommel was down to 35 tanks, did he start to contemplate phase 2 of the Battle of El Alamein, which involved a breakout by 2 British armoured and mechanised divisions. Now, incidentally, it's significant that he had about 10 divisions, but he only sent 2 forward because he had grasped the essentials of fighting the North African campaign. Logistics. A lot easier to supply 2 full-strength divisions than 8 to 10 divisions moving forward. So, the Battle of El Alamein was utterly decisive. Now, it was decisive in one major political sense. At long last, the British Army had demonstrated, without assistance from the Americans, that it could defeat the German army in battle. Not only the German army, but a part of the German army commanded by one of its best generals, Rommel. Now, actually, Rommel was below par, no question about it, but by this stage. He was not physically fit. He'd been at it non-stop since February 1941. He'd not had a break, and he was suffering from trouble with his sinuses and other physical ailments. So eventually Rommel had to go home. He had to go back to Germany to recuperate. This was obviously, again, courtesy of Enigma. Alexander and Montgomery knew of this 48 hours after it had happened, which obviously gave them considerable heart to break out. So the Battle of El Alamein, going back to the politics of it, ensured that Britain remained a major world power, well beyond the time it should have. It ensured, for example, that we had a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. It ensured that the Americans sat on their hands when it came to dismantling the British Empire, something Roosevelt in particular was quite keen on. And it gave heart to a very tired British population. We'd been at war since September the 3rd, 1939. Yes, we'd had deliverances, Dunkirk. Yes, we had fought the Germans to a standstill in the air in daylight. But how were we going to win the war? The only way to really win the war was to defeat the German army in battle, or at least the portion of the German army that could be spared that wasn't fighting the Russians and holding down the rather large empire that the Germans now controlled. Remember, the Germans controlled Europe from the Pyrenees to the North Cape of Norway, and from the North Cape of Norway to Crete. The Germans, and they'd also conquered, at that stage, we're talking summer 1942, they'd also conquered much of Western Russia, the Baltic states, and Finland was their ally. Bulgaria was their ally. Romania was their ally. Hungary was their ally. Slovakia was their ally. Italy was their ally. And there was even a Spanish division fighting on the Russian front. So, a minor setback. That's what El Alamein would have been viewed by the Germans. I don't mean by Rommel, I mean by the German High Command back in Berlin and Rastenburg. So what happened? What happened after the victory? Arguably the most important victory of the 20th century for Britain. What happened after El Alamein? After El Alamein, because we now had competent generals managing our troops in the Middle East and in the 8th Army, the Germans were not allowed they weren't allowed any respite. And furthermore, in November 1942, the Americans and the British intervened much further west in North Africa. They, in an operation codenamed Torch, they invaded Algeria and Morocco. Now they could move east from Morocco and take Tunisia. Did they? No, they didn't. Not easily. But what it did do was ensure that Rommel was not able to gather his forces and make another attack. Rommel actually ended up retreating 1,700 miles. He retreated to the border of Tunisia and Libya. And the British advanced. And it was a great victory. This cheered the British population and the Dominion populations and the imperial populations up no end. The war in North Africa finished in May 1943. And the Germans suffered massive casualties, but more importantly, they suffered massive numbers of surrendered troops. The Germans, in fact, the nickname for the final battles in Tunisia is Tunisgrad, because they lost hundreds of thousands of men captured captured or killed. They could only evacuate by air a few key men, Rommel obviously, other generals, but they lost a huge amount of equipment and vast numbers of men. So, also of course, what it meant was, with the British still controlling Malta, they could, and now the North African coast completely, and there were now air bases all the way along the North African coast, Allied air bases. It meant that they could start sending stuff east via the Mediterranean. Not all of it, obviously. The Germans still controlled Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. The Balearic Islands were effectively under German control. They still controlled Crete, Greece, the Balkans, although Tito was giving them a serious run for their money. But it made possible further and quite quick invasions. And indeed, the fighting in North Africa finished in May 1943. The invasion of Sicily was July 1943. The invasion of southern Italy took place also in the late summer and early autumn of 1943, because the campaign in Sicily only lasted 50 days. So the British were now, from a shipping point of view, in a position to launch, with the help of the Americans, invasions. That simply was not possible until the coast of North Africa had been cleared. Once we'd captured Sicily, we really controlled the western, central and eastern Mediterranean. We never lost Cyprus, for example. So the Germans had lost a major campaign, and it all started at the Second Battle of El Alamein. And as I say, Britain remains more powerful today as a result of the Battle of El Alamein than it otherwise would be. We certainly wouldn't have a permanent position on the UN Security Council. The French don't have a permanent position on the US Security Council, and neither do the Germans. So, more important than you might think, the Battle of El Alamein. Anyway, that's it. Speak to you next week.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and watch our next episode.